No one in courtroom 7 paid much attention to the small cedar box in Evelyn Mercer's hands when she stepped through the doors that gray morning. Not when the benches groaned with reporters and distant cousins, not when the air smelled faintly of rain, paper, and old wood polish, and not even when Charles Mercer's children looked straight through her as if she were part of the wall behind them. They had already decided what she was: the quiet widow, the late-life wife, the woman who wore simple coats and said very little, the one who would sit in the back while serious people discussed serious money. Even the clerk gave the box a quick glance and then looked away, as if it held cough drops, old letters, or some private sadness too small to matter in a room built for rulings. But before that day was over, before the whispers died, before the judge leaned forward and the lawyers stopped breathing so loudly, that little box would do something none of them thought possible. It would tell the room who had been invisible on purpose and who had been living in someone else's house without ever knowing whose house it really was. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, quiet people, buried truth, and the kind of endings that turn a whole room cold, take a second to like and subscribe. And stay until the end, because what happens with that box doesn't just change the case. It changes everything. The courtroom itself was small by city standards, but it felt crowded that morning. The ceiling lights were too bright. A vent somewhere near the rear wall clicked every few seconds, then sighed. Wet umbrellas leaned near the entrance. A reporter in the second row uncapped his pen with his teeth. One of Charles Mercer's former executives sat with both hands folded so tightly that the skin across his knuckles had turned white. At the front, Grant Mercer stood beside his lawyer, looking almost relaxed. That alone told you how sure he was. He had the posture of a man who believed the future had already been signed and filed. Next to him sat his sister Celia, chin lifted, legs crossed, her face arranged into controlled grief. She held a tissue she did not need. And then there was Evelyn. She did not rush. She did not search for sympathy. She moved to her table, set the cedar box down with both hands, and sat. The box made a soft, solid sound against the wood. Not loud, just enough to be heard. Grant glanced at it and smirked. Celia leaned toward him and murmured, too low for most of the room, but not too low for the narrator of this story, and not too low for the woman sitting 3 feet away. She brought a keepsake, Celia whispered. Grant barely moved his mouth. Better than a speech, Evelyn heard. Her face did not change. That was the first thing about Evelyn Mercer that people kept misunderstanding. They thought silence meant weakness. It did not. Sometimes silence meant a person had already learned exactly how long other people could expose themselves if left uninterrupted. The bailiff called the room to order. All rise. Chairs scraped. Fabric rustled. Someone coughed and tried to hide it. Judge Helen Sloan entered, calm as winter. She sat, opened the file in front of her, and looked over the room through half-moon glasses. Be seated. Everyone obeyed. For a few moments there was only paper, the turning of pages, the faint hum of lighting, the distant patter of rain against high courthouse windows. Judge Sloan had handled probate battles before. Estates brought out 2 kinds of people, the grieving and the hungry. Sometimes they were the same people. She knew better than to trust tears or polished outrage. This matter concerns the estate of Charles Edwin Mercer, she said, voice even. Counsel, proceed. Reed Talbot rose first. Your Honor, this is a straightforward probate confirmation. The decedent's surviving adult children, Grant Mercer and Celia Mercer, are present. The estate structure is well documented. We anticipate no genuine dispute as to corporate control, trust distribution, or the validity of prior asset designation. Straightforward. That word settled into the room like dust. Straightforward. Clean. Finished. Evelyn placed one hand on the cedar box. Judge Sloan noticed. Reed continued. Mrs. Mercer was provided for under a spousal living agreement and separate residential arrangement. We do not expect her personal sentiments to alter the controlling documents. Personal sentiments. The words were chosen carefully. That was Reed's skill. He could make a person sound irrelevant without appearing cruel. He could turn a life into a side note by changing the shape of one sentence. Across the aisle, Evelyn's attorney, a quiet older man named Martin Keene, did not stand right away. He waited until Reed sat. Then he rose, slow and steady. Your Honor, we do dispute corporate control. Grant gave a short laugh under his breath. Reed did not turn, but the corner of his mouth shifted. Judge Sloan looked up. On what grounds? Martin placed both palms on counsel table. On the grounds that the assumptions attached to this estate are false. The room sharpened. A reporter sat forward. Grant muttered, "Here we go." Martin continued, "Mrs. Mercer is not here to challenge out of sentiment. She is here because Mercer Holdings, Mercer River Storage, Mercer Cold Line Logistics, and the primary land deeds beneath their earliest operating properties were never owned by the decedent in the way the petition suggests." Now even Celia looked directly at Evelyn. Reed stood. Objection to counsel's characterization. If there is some theatrical claim involving old letters or household memorabilia, it is not theatrical, Martin said. Judge Sloan lifted one hand. One at a time. The vent clicked again. This was the moment when most rooms decide who matters. A strong voice, an expensive suit, a thick file. The woman in the plain coat with the small box had none of the visible signs power likes to advertise. And that, more than anything, is why almost everyone was still underestimating her. Grant rose without waiting to be recognized. "Your Honor, with respect, my father spent 40 years building his company. Everyone in this room knows that. My sister and I have run divisions of it for years. Mrs. Mercer lived in the guest residence. She was cared for, generously. This is not a business dispute. It's grief acting out at the wrong time." Evelyn turned her head then, just enough to look at him. Grant had seen that look before, though he had never understood it. It was the same look she gave when he was 17 and lied badly. The same look she gave when Charles spoke too fast to cover worry. It was not anger. It was patience, with a clock already ticking down. Judge Sloan said, "Mr. Mercer, sit." He sat. The judge faced Martin. "What specifically are you offering?" Martin glanced at Evelyn. She nodded once. The box, "Your Honor." At that there was movement all through the room. Tiny, dismissive movement. A shift of shoulders. A pen paused in midair. Celia exhaled through her nose in disbelief. Reed actually smiled this time. A box. Martin did not blink. "Yes." Judge Sloan's expression stayed careful. "Counsel, unless there are admissible contents relevant to title, equity, or corporate governance, we are not turning this hearing into a scavenger hunt." And that was when Evelyn stood for the first time. Not fast, not shaky. She rose as if the moment had been waiting for her, and she had finally decided to meet it. "Your Honor," she said softly. Her voice surprised the room. It was lower than people expected. Clear, controlled, tired, but not frail. Judge Sloan looked at her over the rim of her glasses. "Mrs. Mercer," Evelyn rested her fingertips on the lid of the box. "I understand why this looks small." No one moved. But so did the first office. A flicker crossed Judge Sloan's face. Grant frowned. Celia's tissue stopped in her hand. And that's when the room took its first real breath of uncertainty. Because the first office was not a phrase that should have come from a woman they had spent years treating like a late addition. It sounded like memory. It sounded like ownership. It sounded like a sentence with roots. But that wasn't the real reason the air changed. The real reason was this. Evelyn did not sound like someone trying to become part of the story. She sounded like someone who had been there before the story had a name. Years before the courtroom. Before the polished towers with the Mercer name cut into stone. Before board dinners and magazine covers and ribbon cuttings, there had been a narrow building near the river with a leaking roof, 2 dented metal desks, and a borrowed fan that made more noise. Then wind. The wallpaper peeled in one corner. The back room smelled like oil, damp cardboard, and burnt coffee. Outside, trucks rolled through muddy ruts, and men laughed too loud to hide how broke they all were. Charles Mercer had stood in the middle of that tiny room with big hands, rolled sleeves, and more dreams than credit. He had charm, energy, and a way of making impossible things sound only delayed. But charm did not buy land. Energy did not pay banknotes. And in those days, Charles Mercer had both a failed business behind him and creditors who watched his name like hawks watched open fields. Evelyn knew this because she was there, not as a secretary, not as a housekeeper, not as a woman who came later. She was there before the first lock was turned. Back then, she was Evelyn Hart, 30 years old, her hair dark, her eyes even steadier than they were now, carrying grief from her father's death and a modest inheritance he left behind, a river orchard, a small house, and just enough insurance money to change one life if used carefully. Charles wanted to borrow against everything. The banks would not touch him. So Evelyn sold the orchard. That part almost no one knew. She sold the land where she learned to walk, the land where her father taught her how to mend a fence, count invoices, and judge a person by how they treated workers after sunset. She sold the trees and rows she could have found blindfolded. She sold the future she had been given so Charles could build the future he wanted. But even that money could not safely pass through Charles, not with the old debts hanging over him. Their lawyer at the time, a hard, practical woman named Joan Morrow, gave them one clean solution. Buy the first property in Evelyn's name. Form the new holding company under her ownership. Let Charles operate it. Let Evelyn control the paper until the risk passes. Temporary, they called it, just for a while. That phrase has ruined more lives than some crimes. The Room, years later, never heard Joan Morrow say it, but the papers had. And paper remembers longer than pride does. Back in the present, Reed Talbot broke the silence with a sharp little sound of disbelief. Your Honor, if counsel wishes to tell a family legend, perhaps we should recess for folklore hour. A few people laughed. Too soon. Too hard. Evelyn turned her head toward Reed and said, Joan Morrow did not tell stories. The laughter died. Reed stared. Judge Sloane's eyes narrowed. You knew Joan Morrow? Evelyn looked at the judge. She drew the papers. She also told Charles not to lose them. Grant leaned toward his lawyer. This is ridiculous, but inside Grant, something small had started to move. Not belief, not yet, just discomfort. The kind that comes when a room stops behaving the way you expected. Martin said, with the court's permission, Mrs. Mercer would like to present the contents in sequence. Judge Sloane waited 1 second too long for comfort. Then she nodded. Proceed. The brass latch gave a quiet click when Evelyn opened the box. That sound was tiny. Still, people felt it. Cedar rose into the air, warm and old. The smell was clean, steady, real. It did not belong in a courtroom full of fresh toner, damp coats, and legal tension. For a second, it felt like another place had opened inside the room. Inside the box were bundles wrapped in soft white cloth, a key tied with faded blue ribbon, a dark leather ledger, and 3 sealed envelopes. Celia stared. What is this? Evelyn did not look at her. History. Martin took the first wrapped bundle and carefully unfolded the cloth. Inside was a deed packet, edges worn but preserved, held together by an old metal clasp. He handed it to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. Judge Sloane adjusted her glasses and read. The courtroom waited. Only the rain made noise. Then the judge looked up. This deed, she said slowly, for the riverfront parcel acquired on May 14th, lists purchaser as Evelyn Hart. Grant's chair scraped. That can't be right. Celia turned to Reed. What is she reading? Reed was already flipping through his own file. Too fast. Not smooth anymore. Martin spoke into the silence. The riverfront parcel, Your Honor, being the original operating site of Mercer River Storage, the property on which the first company office stood. Grant shook his head. My father bought that land. Evelyn answered him without raising her voice. No, he built on it. That line landed harder than shouting could have, because it was simple, and simple truth is very hard to argue with in real time. Judge Sloane looked back down. There is also a financing note attached. Martin nodded, signed with funds traced from Miss Hart's inheritance account at the time. Reed stood quickly. Your Honor, even if such a deed exists, an early property holding does not determine current corporate ownership. People lend money. People hold title temporarily. Sentimental claims wrapped around obsolete documents do not override a modern estate structure. He was recovering now. Reed knew how to regroup. Attack scope, reduce significance. Move the fight away from whatever hurts most. Grant sat straighter again. Yes, that made sense. An old deed was annoying, not fatal. And for a brief moment, the Mercer side settled. But that wasn't the real reason Evelyn had brought the box. Not the deed, not the key, not even the ledger, though that would matter soon. What they didn't notice was how carefully she had placed the sealed envelopes to one side, untouched, as if the smaller truths could come first, as if the bigger one could wait. If you've ever watched someone be judged before they even speak, then you already know why this next part matters. Stay with me, because the room still thought that first paper was the whole surprise. It wasn't even the door. It was only the handle. The second item from the box was the leather ledger. Martin opened it with both hands. The spine cracked softly, not from damage, but from age and long use. Pages inside were filled with clean, neat writing in blue-black ink. Dates, payments, share allocations, officer notes. Judge Sloan accepted it. Reed objected at once. Unless foundation is established, handwritten notations, Martin said, the foundation is established by continuity, corresponding banking records, and matching corporate filings entered years later under Mercer Holdings transition documents. Reed stopped speaking. That name had done something to him. Transition documents. He knew those existed. Everyone who had worked old Mercer files knew there had been a restructuring in the early years. He had reviewed summaries. But summaries were not originals. Summaries were what later people thought mattered. Originals were more dangerous. Originals carried intention. Judge Sloan turned a page, then another. Her expression changed almost invisibly. Not shock, not yet. Concentration, deepening. She read aloud. Initial capitalization. Evelyn Hart, 62%. Charles Mercer, 38%. The room exploded. Not loudly at first. Just a storm of whispers breaking loose all at once. No way. Did she say 62? That's impossible. Order, barked the bailiff. Grant was already on his feet. That is false. That is absolutely false. Celia's face drained of color, then flushed again. This is some old bookkeeping trick. Evelyn looked at her, and for the first time there was pain in her eyes. Not anger. Pain. No. Celia, she said quietly. It's the first truth you were never told. Celia went still. How much had Celia really known? Very little. When she was a girl, she remembered her father and Evelyn in the same room often, heads close over papers, talking in low tones after dinner. She remembered once asking why Evelyn signed checks when the company was Dad's. Charles had smiled too fast and said, because she has better handwriting. The whole table had laughed, including Celia. That memory came back now with a heat she hated. Judge Sloan held up a hand again for silence. Mr. Talbot, do you contest the signature entries? Reed swallowed once. I contest relevance until full chain is established. Martin was ready. Then, let us establish it. He presented a certified copy packet from archived state filings, a secondary set of stock registry references, and a sequence of early meeting minutes. The clerk moved them forward. The judge read. The room waited in growing unease. It became harder and harder to breathe in there, though the vents still sighed and the room temperature had not changed. That is what pressure does. It makes air feel thick. Grant turned toward Evelyn as if she had personally insulted the laws of nature. If this were true, why didn't anyone know? Evelyn answered, someone did. Grant's jaw tightened. Then why hide it? Now the box, the room, the case, all of it tilted toward something deeper than ownership, because that is the question beneath most family battles. Not what happened. Why was I not told? Evelyn rested one palm on the table. Because your father was in debt. Because the first time he nearly lost everything, my name kept creditors from seizing it before the company had a chance to stand. Because later, when the company grew, moving control would have triggered lawsuits from men who still wanted pieces of what they thought he owed. Because then there were banks, then expansion, then press, then your mother's divorce lawyers, then your father's pride, and then... She stopped. Judge Sloan asked gently, and then what, Mrs. Mercer? Evelyn's eyes lowered for 1 second to the cedar box. Then my daughter died. Silence. Real silence this time. Heavy, immediate, complete. Even Grant did not speak. Evelyn continued, voice softer now. After Rose died, I stopped caring whether my name was on a building. I cared whether the workers got paid, whether shipments cleared, whether the insurance renewals were filed on time, whether your father remembered to eat when he was working 3 days without sleep. Public credit felt small after that. Celia blinked hard. Grant looked away. The room had known Charles Mercer, the empire builder. Fewer had known Rose existed at all. She had died young, sick fast, gone before the magazines, before the towers, before the family learned to pose around power like it had always been there. Martin let the silence breathe. Then he said, Mrs. Mercer maintained controlling interest throughout. She did not exercise it publicly. That is not the same as losing it. Reed found his footing again. Or perhaps it is evidence that these were nominal allocations later superseded in practice. There it was. Last safe argument. Paper may say one thing. Real life said another. Judge Sloan looked toward Evelyn. Were the shares ever transferred? No. Sold? No. Assigned into trust? No. Pledged? Never. Grant laughed once, but there was no humor in it. So we're supposed to believe my father spent 40 years building a company he didn't own? Evelyn looked straight at him. He built it. He did not own all of it. Those are not the same thing. That line cut through the room like glass, because many people understood it at once. Employees build. Wives build. Quiet partners build. Men get called founders when history is written by the loudest person left standing. Reed stepped forward. Your Honor, even if early percentages were as claimed, long corporate evolution makes this incomplete. Control today would depend on subsequent issuances, mergers, dilution, and board action. Martin nodded. Exactly. He turned to Evelyn. She touched the third item, the blue ribbon key. Not the sealed envelopes, not yet. The third item, Martin said, is a key to Mercer Holdings' private document vault at the original Ridge Avenue office. A vault whose contents were cataloged under dual authorization. One signatory deceased, one living. Reed's face changed. Only a little, but enough. Grant noticed. Reed? The lawyer did not answer right away, because yes, he knew about the vault. Not the contents, but the existence. He had been told it held legacy records, obsolete agreements, old insurance binders, maybe founder correspondence, things rich families preserve because rich families hate throwing away proof of their own beginnings. He had requested a review after Charles died. He had been informed access required dual signatory override or court order. He had assumed that meant executor procedure. He had not asked whose second authorization it was, and that, more than anything, was the moment Reed understood the problem was not old paper. The problem was that Evelyn had never needed to fight loudly because she had never actually been outside the walls. She had been inside them the entire time. Judge Sloan asked Mrs. Mercer, "Are you saying current records remain under your legal access?" Evelyn answered, "They always were." Celia whispered, no. Grant turned on her. "Stop." But he said it because he was talking to himself too. The hearing paused for 12 minutes while the judge reviewed admitted materials in chambers. During that time, the courtroom turned into a living thing made of whispers. Reporters stepped out to send updates. One former executive stared at Evelyn as though trying to rebuild 20 years of meetings in his mind. The Mercer children stayed close to Reed, who spoke quietly, but very fast. Evelyn sat alone. That made the picture even stronger. Everyone around Grant moved with urgency. Around Evelyn, there was stillness, and that stillness looked less like weakness now and more like confidence people were only beginning to recognize. Martin leaned toward her. "You're doing fine." Evelyn kept her eyes on the box. "I know. Do you want water?" She shook her head. Her hand hovered near the first sealed envelope, then withdrew. Not yet. She was timing it carefully. Always had. That was another thing people misunderstood. Quiet people are often better at timing than everyone else in the room. When court resumed, the tension came back sharper than before. Judge Sloan returned, sat, and called the room to order. Having reviewed the initial exhibits, she said, "This court finds the materials sufficiently relevant to continue inquiry into disputed ownership and control. Mr. Talbot, the estate's assumption of straightforward corporate succession is no longer tenable on the present record." Grant closed his eyes for 1 second. Celia pressed her lips together so tightly they nearly vanished. Reed rose. "Then we request formal authentication procedures and immediate sealing of public discussion until chain analysis." "You will have authentication," Judge Sloan said. "You will not have the luxury of pretending this is settled." There it was, the first real power shift. Not final, but visible. And if you're still here, this is the moment to remember. The room began the morning treating Evelyn like an afterthought. Now the judge herself was speaking to the Mercer side as if they were the ones with explaining to do. If stories like this are your kind of story, take a second to like the video, because what comes next is where the small box stops being surprising and starts becoming devastating. Judge Sloan turned back to Martin. "Continue." Martin nodded. Mrs. Mercer would like to address why she remained silent for so long, because the opposing side keeps treating silence as evidence against her. Permission granted with one look from the bench. Evelyn stood again. "My husband," she said, and the room noticed she used husband, not Charles, was a proud man. Proud men are easy to admire when things work and hard to live with when they don't. He wanted to build something no one could laugh at. In the beginning, I wanted that for him too. We had an agreement. Temporary. Then later, there was always a reason not to disturb it. Grant muttered, "Convenient." Evelyn turned toward him. "Do you remember the winter the warehouse roof collapsed?" He said nothing. "You were 15. Your father was in Chicago. Insurance was about to deny the claim because the maintenance file was incomplete. I drove through snow at midnight to the old annex and found the inspection book myself. I slept in the truck until morning so the adjuster couldn't say the office had been opened after the fact." Grant stared. He remembered the story. Sort of. He remembered his father returning and saying, "We got lucky." He remembered workers cheering. He remembered seeing Evelyn at breakfast, hair wet, hands red from cold, saying almost nothing. Lucky. That word sounded uglier now. Evelyn continued, "Do you remember when the union threatened to strike at Cold Line?" Grant's voice came out smaller than he wanted. "That was Dad." "No," Evelyn said. "Your father wanted to threaten them back. I told him if he did, he'd lose 3 states before spring. So I took coffee and payroll books into a room with 6 angry men and listened until dawn." Celia shifted in her seat. Evelyn looked at her next. "Do you remember when you were 19 and the magazines called your father self-made?" Celia swallowed. "Everyone called him that." "Yes," said Evelyn. "Everyone did. Not sharp, not bitter, just true. There are truths so plain they become unbearable only after you hear them in the right room." Reed rose again, trying to contain the damage. "Your Honor, even if Mrs. Mercer contributed materially, emotional labor and informal business support do not establish sole or controlling ownership." Martin said, "Of course not." Then he reached for the first sealed envelope. Reed stopped speaking. The air changed again. You could feel it in the benches, in the way people leaned without meaning to, in the way Judge Sloan set her pen down instead of writing, in the way Celia's fingers finally crushed the tissue she had been carrying like a prop all morning. Martin lifted the envelope carefully. This was sealed by Charles Mercer 11 years ago, signed across the flap, and left in Mrs. Mercer's possession with instructions to open only if her ownership was denied after his death. Grant's face lost its color. "No," he said. Evelyn closed her eyes for half a second. That envelope had weight far beyond paper. It was not just evidence. It was the last version of Charles that could still speak. Judge Sloan said, "Open it." The room held its breath. Martin slid a letter free, along with a notarized board resolution copy and a small card with a company seal pressed into it. He handed the materials to the clerk, then to the judge. Judge Sloan read first in silence, then aloud. "If this letter is being read, it means one of 2 things. Either I did not live long enough to set things right in person, or the people I hoped would act with decency chose ambition instead." No one moved. She continued, "For the record, and for any court that may need plain language more than polished stories, Mercer Holdings began with Evelyn's land, Evelyn's money, and Evelyn's name protecting what I could not yet safely hold. The controlling shares issued to her were real. They were never ceremonial. They were never revoked. Every major expansion after that was built under a structure we both understood. I led the company. She anchored it. If anyone says otherwise, they are either mistaken or lying." The judge stopped, not because there was no more letter, because the room needed a second. Grant sat down so abruptly the chair legs hit the floor hard. Celia's mouth opened, then closed. Reed looked like a man trying to calculate in the middle of an earthquake. Judge Sloan kept reading. "I should have corrected the public record of our story years ago. I did not. That failure belongs to me. Pride is a poor architect of family peace. If my children hear this, they may feel betrayed. I understand that. But betrayal did not begin with the truth being spoken. It began when I kept it from them." Celia's eyes filled then, though she fought the tears as if they were an insult. Grant stared at the table. But the judge was not done. Attached to the letter was a notarized board resolution, executed during a corporate restructuring affirming Evelyn Mercer as continuing majority voting holder and requiring her signature for transfer of controlling interest upon Charles's death or incapacity. Reed whispered, "Jesus." He did not mean to say it out loud. Judge Sloan heard him anyway. "So," she said, looking directly at him now, "the estate's claim to automatic corporate control appears substantially flawed." Reed straightened himself. "We will need full forensic review." You will have it." Grant stood again, but this time the strength had gone strange in him. "My father never told us." The line sounded less like protest and more like a child arriving late to the worst room in the house. Evelyn turned to him with something close to sorrow. "I know. Why not?" She looked at the box. "Because every year he thought there would be a better time." Grant shook his head hard. "No. No. If this is true, then you let us believe." "I let your father decide when to tell you," Evelyn said. "That is one of the things I regret." That answer hit harder, because it gave him no villain simple enough to hate. The truth was no longer a weapon pointed in one direction. It had edges on every side. And that's when everything changed. Not because the letter proved ownership. It did. Not because the judge was listening differently. She was. Everything changed because for the first time, Grant and Celia had to see Evelyn not as a shadow near their father, but as someone whose restraint had protected their comfort for decades. That is a hard thing to forgive in the moment, not because it is wrong, because it makes your whole life look borrowed. The court entered a deeper phase of argument then. Numbers, structure, share lineage, historical control. Reed fought hard, because good lawyers do. He argued dilution. He argued later issuances. He argued governance through conduct. Martin answered with archived registries, distributions, officer minutes, tax assignments, and the legal distinction between visible leadership and actual majority control. Judge Sloan took notes. The room wore down. Rain turned to a softer tapping high on the windows. Someone's phone buzzed once and was silenced at once. A reporter's pen ran out and she shook it in frustration. Through it all, the cedar box remained open. Still, 2 envelopes left. People kept forgetting that. Maybe because the first letter felt like enough. Maybe because the human mind likes endings earlier than truth allows. Around what would have been the 60% mark in any good telling, the hearing tightened again. Reed had one final strategy left. If he could not erase Evelyn's early ownership, maybe he could suggest she had later surrendered practical control through a private settlement or unsigned family arrangement. It was thin, but thin things can still wound if no one answers them. He stepped closer to the witness space. "Mrs. Mercer, isn't it true that after Charles Mercer's stroke, informal family discussions took place regarding transition?" "Yes. And isn't it true that you did not oppose Grant Mercer taking operational authority?" "I did not oppose operations," Evelyn said. "That is not the same as surrendering ownership, but you allowed him to behave as successor." Evelyn answered, "He behaved that way, whether I allowed it or not." Several people in the courtroom made involuntary sounds, half surprise, half grim recognition. Grant flushed dark red. "That's unfair." Evelyn looked at him. "Is it?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Reed pushed forward. "Did you ever tell him directly he was not inheriting control?" Evelyn's face changed then. Something sadder, older. "No," she said. "A significant omission." "Yes." "Why?" The whole room leaned in. This mattered. Not legally, maybe not fully, but emotionally, completely. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the final sealed envelope still resting in the box. "Because," she said, "I wanted to believe his father would." That line broke whatever was left of Celia's careful mask. She put a hand over her mouth and looked down, not because she suddenly liked Evelyn. Grief is not that simple, but because she knew that sentence belonged to a real marriage, not a performance. It sounded like decades. It sounded like waiting inside disappointment without turning it into war. Judge Sloan let the silence stand. Then Martin reached for the second sealed envelope. Reed shut his eyes. He already knew whatever was in there would be bad. He was right. The second envelope contained a transcript certification and a storage receipt for an audio recording made after Charles's stroke during a competency review process. Martin explained that the original recording had already been lodged with the court earlier that morning under sealed evidentiary handling. The transcript had now been cleared for limited review. Judge Sloan read part of it aloud. "Question, Mr. Mercer. In the event of your death, who holds controlling authority over Mercer Holdings?" She turned the page. "Answer. My wife, Evelyn Mercer. She always did. Anybody telling you different is trying to get around the truth." Grant bowed his head. Celia shut her eyes. Judge Sloan continued. "Question, why has this not been made more public?" The answer came next. "Because I kept putting it off, and because my children like the myth of me better than the truth of us." That one cut deepest. Not because it was the harshest line, because it was the truest. Families do not only inherit money. They inherit stories, and when the story is flattering, people cling to it with both hands. Reed sat down. There are moments when even the best lawyer understands the structure has fallen. He may still argue over debris, but he knows the building is gone. Judge Sloan looked across both tables. At this point, the court is prepared to issue temporary recognition of disputed controlling interest in favor of Mrs. Mercer pending expedited authentication, preservation orders, and injunction against any estate transfer, board maneuver, or asset movement inconsistent with her asserted majority rights. Grant jerked upright. You can't just hand her everything. Judge Sloan's stare stopped him cold. I am not handing anyone anything, Mr. Mercer. I am preventing people from taking what may not be theirs. That sentence settled over the room like stone. And still, one envelope remained. Most people forgot. Martin had not. Evelyn had not. Judge Sloan had not. The judge glanced toward the box. There is one more item. Yes, Martin said. Grant's voice came out thin. What else could there possibly be? Evelyn answered him with a look more tired than triumphant. The part that should have come first. She took the final envelope herself. Not Martin. Not the clerk. Her hands were steady, but only because they had practiced steadiness through things much worse than court. When she opened it, a small object slid into her palm along with one folded document. It was a photograph. Old, slightly faded, protected in a sleeve. She held it for a moment before passing it up. Judge Sloan looked at it first, then at Evelyn, then back at the photo. Explain this, she said. Evelyn did. That was taken in the first office. The day the company papers were signed, the clerk displayed the photo to the room. There, in grainy black and white, stood a younger Charles Mercer with one hand on a desk and a broad, impossible smile. Beside him stood Evelyn, younger too, hair dark, jaw set, holding a folder against her chest. On the wall behind them hung a handmade sign. Not Mercer & Co., not Charles Mercer Logistics. It read, E. Hart Holdings. The room actually gasped. Not because signs cannot be changed. They can. Not because photos cannot lie. They sometimes do. But because hidden in plain sight behind them, taped crooked to the filing cabinet, was the first capitalization sheet with their percentages visible enough to read under enlargement. 62/38. No mythology survives contact with a photograph like that. Grant went pale. Celia whispered, "Oh my God." And then Martin handed up the folded document that came with it, a marriage certificate dated 2 years before the first public launch of Mercer Holdings, proving Evelyn was not some late-life spouse attached to Charles's sunset years. She had been there near the beginning, not at the edge, at the center. Charles had spent years letting the world tell a simpler story because simple stories sell. Self-made man. Lone founder. Built from nothing. The kind of lie people do not even hear as a lie once it has been repeated long enough. But nothing had not built Mercer Holdings. A woman had. A woman with orchard money, ledger hands, tired eyes, and a cedar box no one respected until it was too late. The shock in the courtroom was not loud now. It was worse than loud. It was inward. People recalculating, reframing, revisiting every company dinner, every speech, every anniversary article, realizing the wrong person had been edited out of the opening chapter. Grant looked at Evelyn as though he were seeing her for the first time and hating himself for how long it took. "Why keep the picture?" he asked. She answered without hesitation. "Because it was the only one where the sign was still on the wall." He let out a breath that sounded almost like pain. Celia stared at the photograph with tears finally sliding free. "He made us live inside a story." Evelyn looked at her, and this time there was no defense in Celia's face. Only hurt. "Yes," Evelyn said. "He did." The judge placed the photo down very carefully. Then she spoke. "Let the record reflect that the court has been presented with documentary, testimonial, archival, and visual evidence substantially supporting Mrs. Mercer's claim of original and continued controlling ownership interests. Temporary authority over contested corporate actions is recognized in Mrs. Mercer pending final certification. Any attempt to circumvent this order will be met harshly." Grant sank back into his chair. Reed removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Celia just stared forward. For a few seconds, no one moved. Not the reporters, not the executives, not even the clerk. Shock does that. Real shock. It freezes the small motions first. The final sound in the room was almost nothing at all. Evelyn closing the box. Click. That little brass latch again. The same sound they had ignored at the start. Only now it sounded like a door closing on one life and opening on another. After the ruling, people rushed her. That was almost funny. The same people who had looked through her now stepped toward her with urgent eyes and careful voices. Reporters lifted microphones. Former executives asked for a meeting. An assistant from the corporate office wanted immediate signature guidance. Someone from finance was already pale over what unauthorized transition memos might now mean. Evelyn did not answer them right away. She remained seated until the room thinned. That, too, was power. Grant approached first, but without the old force. He looked older now. Not in years, in certainty. "I didn't know," he said. "I know. You should have told us." "I should have," Evelyn said. "And he should have." He nodded once, because there was nothing to fight in that answer. What happens now? Now. A small word, heavy when it follows the collapse of entitlement. Evelyn looked toward the high window where the rain had slowed to a silver sheen. "Now," she said, "the workers keep their jobs. The vendors get paid. The board meets with honest books on the table. And your father's name stays on the buildings, because he did build them." Grant blinked. "After all this, you'd keep his name there?" Evelyn's mouth trembled into the faintest, almost smile. "I'm not interested in revenge, Grant. I'm interested in accuracy. That line would have stayed with him for years." Celia came next, slower. Her voice was unsteady. "Was any of it real? Between you and him?" Evelyn turned fully toward her. "Yes." Celia nodded, and the tears she had fought so hard now came without disguise. Not graceful tears, angry ones, hurt ones. The tears of a daughter learning her father loved her and lied to her in the same lifetime. "I don't know what to do with this," Celia whispered. Evelyn looked at the cedar box, then back at her. Neither did he. That was as close to forgiveness as either of them could manage that day. Reed Talbot waited longest. When he finally approached, the courthouse had gone quieter. Footsteps echoing farther away, the afternoon light turning pale across the polished floor. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and this time there was no polished ease in his tone. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn studied him. "For underestimating you?" she asked. He gave a thin, honest smile. "For assuming history belonged to the people who spoke loudest?" Evelyn nodded once. "That's a common mistake." He looked at the closed box. Did Charles ever mean to tell them? She thought about that. About promises made in hallways, about tired nights, about hospital rooms, about the way people postpone hard truth until postponement becomes its own betrayal. "Yes," she said at last. "He meant to." Reed lowered his eyes. "Meaning to is rarely enough." "No," Evelyn said. "It isn't." Outside the courthouse, the world had already started reacting. News alerts moved faster than grief. Mercer Empire ownership disputed. Widow produces new evidence. Founder's children stunned in probate hearing. Cars hissed over wet pavement. Camera crews gathered behind barriers. People who had never heard Evelyn Mercer's name before that morning were suddenly speaking it into microphones. She paused under the stone steps, the cedar box tucked under one arm. For a moment, she did not go to the waiting car. She looked up at the cloudy sky and let the damp air touch her face. Sometimes the victory people imagine is not the one that matters. Sometimes it is not applause or headlines or humiliation returned in equal measure. Sometimes victory is much quieter. A record corrected, a lie interrupted, a life finally named in full. Weeks later, the verification was complete. Every signature matched, every registry aligned, every old filing that seemed minor on its own locked into place like teeth in a key. Evelyn Mercer was confirmed as the controlling owner of the core Mercer companies and the underlying land structures that held the empire together. The estate everyone had been fighting over turned out to be far smaller than Grant and Celia believed. The art, the homes, personal holdings, private accounts, yes, there was still wealth there, great wealth. But the engine, the heart, the machine that made the Mercer world what it was, belonged to Evelyn. People said she could have removed the Mercer children from everything. She did not. She restructured the board. She froze reckless plans. She commissioned a full employee pension review and expanded it. She restored health benefits in 2 divisions where cuts had been quietly planned. She opened a scholarship fund in Rose's name for workers' children studying accounting, logistics, nursing, and trade work. Not glamorous degrees. Useful ones. That was Evelyn all over. Even in triumph, she thought about who kept things running. Grant stayed on for a year, then stepped aside on his own. Pride had not vanished, but it had changed shape. He started showing up differently in meetings after that day, less certain, more informed. For the first time in his life, he learned what the numbers beneath the speeches actually looked like. Celia did something harder. She began reading the archives, not for control, for understanding. Old photos, early invoices, insurance letters, handwritten notes in margins. She cried more than once. She laughed once too, unexpectedly, at a page where Charles had written, "Ask Evelyn before doing anything expensive," then ignored his own advice 3 lines later. Judge Sloan never spoke publicly about the case beyond her orders. Judges rarely do. But in a legal training seminar months later, she said one thing, without names: never mistake polish for proof, and never dismiss the person carrying the oldest records. People wrote that down. As for the box, Evelyn kept it. Of course she did. She did not place it in a museum or company display. She did not turn it into a symbol for speeches. It returned to the shelf in her study beside a framed photo of Rose and one of Charles taken years before success simplified his face. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the house was quiet and the world finally stopped trying to rename her, she would rest her hand on the cedar lid and remember the weight of carrying truth alone for so long. There is one more thing you should know. Months after the ruling, Grant came to see her at the old house by himself. No lawyers, no cameras, no assistants. He stood in the doorway with his father's watch in his hand. "I found this in his desk," he said. It had a note. Evelyn took the folded paper. In Charles Mercer's unmistakable hand, it read, "If I do this too late, tell her I knew. Tell her I always knew who kept the walls standing." Evelyn closed her eyes. Not because the note fixed anything. It did not. There are apologies that arrive like flowers at the wrong funeral. Beautiful, late, useless in the practical sense, but still human, still worth holding for 1 second before letting go. Grant asked, "Did he love us?" Evelyn looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "badly sometimes, but yes." That answer freed something in him. Not all at once. Healing almost never works like that. But enough. Enough for him to sit down in the kitchen where he had once stormed through like an heir and now sat like a son. Enough for Evelyn to make tea. Enough for them to speak, not as winners and losers, but as 2 people left behind by the same complicated man. And maybe that is the final turn in this story. Not the ruling, not the box, not even the ownership. The final turn is this. Truth did not only expose greed, it also exposed grief. And once grief is visible, people sometimes become more honest than they ever meant to be. Years later, the story people told about Mercer Holdings changed. Not overnight. Big lies are stubborn. They leave roots. But slowly, articles were corrected. Company history pages were rewritten. A portrait of Evelyn was added to the original headquarters hall, not painted grandly, not dressed up beyond recognition, just Evelyn as she was. Silver hair, calm eyes, plain coat, one hand resting on a cedar box. Under it was a line she approved only after 3 revisions. Evelyn Mercer, original majority owner, keeper of the first risk, not founder's widow, not supporter, not companion, owner. The word had taken a lifetime to reach her in public, but when it arrived, it stayed. And if you picture that courtroom one last time, picture it clearly. The bright overhead lights, the damp smell of rain, the restless shifting of people certain they were about to witness a routine inheritance hearing, the polished son, the composed daughter, the lawyer with all the confidence. Paperwork can lend, the judge already tired of rich family drama, and then, near the edge of that heavy room, the woman they had all practiced not seeing, carrying a cedar box no bigger than a family Bible. They ignored it because it looked too small. They mocked it because it looked too old. They dismissed it because it was in her hands. And when it opened, it did not just reveal papers. It revealed the oldest truth in the room. The person who carries the quiet records is often the person who carried everything else. So let me ask you this before we end. Have you ever seen the quietest person in the room turn out to be the strongest one there? If you were Grant or Celia, could you forgive the truth for arriving that late? And if you were Evelyn, would you have opened the box sooner or waited exactly as long as she did? If this story stayed with you, like and subscribe. Share it with someone who believes quiet people are easy to overlook, and come back for the next story, because sometimes the smallest box in the room holds the whole weight of a life.